Hey, quick question. Have you ever skipped breakfast and instantly regretted it? Now imagine doing that before charging into battle with a sword in one hand and a wooden shield in the other. Yeah, medieval soldiers didn't have the luxury of skipping meals. Every bite they took mattered, not for taste, not for Instagram, but for survival. Today, we're diving into the actual foods that powered the toughest warriors in history. Gritty, greasy, and definitely not gourmet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're watching from. Let's kick things off with something that would make modern oatmeal look like a 5-star brunch. Boiled barley with salted fat. This was the go-to breakfast for soldiers about to risk their lives. Barley was cheap, easy to grow in nearly any climate, and ridiculously filling. Mix it with chunks of salted pork fat or beef tallow, and you've got yourself a war meal. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't tasty. But it worked. Soldiers would boil massive pots of barley until it turned into a thick, flavorless mush. Then they'd stir in the fat. Not for fun, but because fat meant calories. A single bowl could keep a guy fueled from sunup to high noon. No spices, no sugar, just sludge that slid down your throat and sat in your gut like a sandbag. Think of it like a medieval protein shake, except made with pig fat and despair. The barley fats combo wasn't just filling, it was strategic. Carbs for quick energy, fat for endurance, and since chewing took too long, this mushy mess could be scarfed down fast. Picture soldiers half asleep, crouched around a campfire, spooning goop into their mouths before marching into battle. They weren't looking for flavor. They were chasing stamina. Because when swords are flying, the last thing you want is low blood sugar. But don't worry, we're just getting started. Let's talk about a food so pungent, it doubled as both a power-up and a natural deterrent. Crushed garlic and onion paste. This wasn't a side dish. This was armor for your insides. Medieval soldiers rubbed this raw, smelly concoction on everything: bread, stew, even meat if they had it. Garlic contains allicin, a compound released only when the clove is crushed. That's what gave it its antibiotic and immune-boosting powers. Back then, knights were allotted 6 cloves of garlic a day. Common soldiers got 3, because even in the world of halberds and helmets, class systems still existed. Soldiers carried little clay pots of garlic onion paste tied to their belts. Portable, pungent, and powerful. It gave them energy and kept sickness away. Important when you're living in tents with sweaty men who haven't bathed in 3 weeks. Plus, the smell was so intense, some soldiers believed it scared off enemies, and honestly, it probably did. A battalion full of men who reeked of raw garlic was basically an airborne threat. Now, if you think hard cheese and old bread sound a little more civilized, think again. In the Middle Ages, those 2 items were basically edible bricks. But here's the thing. Old cheese and stale bread weren't just tolerated, they were essential. Hard cheeses like aged cheddar or goat cheese could last for weeks without refrigeration. The aging process reduced moisture, making them less likely to spoil. Soldiers wrapped chunks in cloth or stuffed them in leather satchels. By the time they reached battle, the cheese was sometimes so firm, it doubled as a blunt weapon. Bread was even tougher, literally. Army bakers intentionally overcooked it, turning loaves into dense, mold-digestant slabs. Sound familiar? It's basically what we now call hardtack. Soldiers would dunk pieces into water, ale, or stew, just to soften them enough to chew. And if the bread didn't break your teeth, congrats, you still had enough molars left to fight. But this combo bread and cheese was smart. No cooking, long shelf life, full of carbs, protein, fat, and calcium. It even served multiple purposes. Some used flatbread as plates, others as insulation for their boot. Bread wasn't just food, it was gear. And what did they wash it all down with? Not water. Never water. Water got you sick. So instead, soldiers turned to a surprising drink: thick medieval ale. Get everything you know about beer. This stuff was more like a barley smoothie: chunky, cloudy, and loaded with floating grain bits. But it was safer than water, thanks to the fermentation process killing off bacteria. Soldiers weren't microbiologists, but they knew one thing. Ale didn't make you vomit your guts out like untreated river water did. A single quart of this stuff packed around 500 calories. It wasn't just a drink. It was liquid bread. Some even chewed it as they drank. Yes, chewed. And the mild alcohol content helped calm their nerves, without knocking them off their feet. There was a saying at the time, a cup of ale brings courage, a barrel brings defeat. In other words, space yourself, or you'll end up charging the wrong direction. But let's say it was dinner time, and the campfires were lit. What did the soldiers turn to? You guessed it, stewed legumes. Beans, peas, and lentils were the kings of the campfire. Dried, easy to transport, and packed with protein. A single pound of dried beans could feed for soldiers once cooked. Military cooks would dump them into giant cauldrons with water and boil them into thick mush. Not tasty, but oh man, they were effective. Legumes gave slow-burning energy. Some armies even planted legume crops along planned routes to feed their troops. And let's be real, the side effects were legendary. A belly full of beans could alert enemies before a single arrow was loosed. Alright, so we've got boiled barley mush, garlic paste bombs, cheese bricks, and chunky beer soup powering these medieval tanks in chainmail. But what if soldiers needed something hearty, something primal, something that made you feel like you could punch a castle wall and leave a dent? Enter meat. Real meat. On the bone. Now, meat was not something medieval soldiers ate every day. This wasn't the Middle Ages version of Burger King. Meat was a prize reserved for moments that really counted, right before big battles or after hard-won victories. And we're not talking tender steaks or perfectly seasoned ribs. Think goat, boar, maybe pork if they were lucky. And yes, sometimes even horse. Yeah, horse. Troops weren't picky. If it walked and had meat on it, it could end up in the pot. Cooking methods were limited, but efficient. Roasting over open fires was the go-to. Picture dozens of skewers turning above hot flames, meat sizzling, fat dripping, and smoke swirling through camp. That smell? Probably the best thing those guys experienced. All month, when time allowed, they'd throw meat into cauldrons to create rich, fatty stews. Nothing fancy, just water, bones, and heat. But it was hot, it was filling, and it reminded you that you weren't dead yet. Leaders and knights got the best cuts, hunches, loins, anything tender. Regular soldiers, they got the chewy, gristly bits. Sometimes bones were cracked open so troops could suck out the marrow, which was considered a strength booster and an energy bomb in one. But what if the army needed meat to last, especially on long campaigns? That's where salted and smoked meat came in. Strips of pork or goat were packed in salt, then hung near fires to dry into a tough version of jerky. It wasn't delicious, it wasn't soft, but it wouldn't rot. Soldiers chewed on it like old leather. Honestly, it probably was old leather sometimes, but when calories are gold, you don't argue with jerky that survives the apocalypse. Now let's get a little weirder, because what's a good medieval diet? Gruel? That's right, gruel. This was the filler food, the backup plan, the thing you ate when everything else ran out, or when you just needed to stretch supplies. Made by boiling grains like barley, rye, or oats. In a massive pot of water, gruel was watery, bland, and about as exciting as eating warm wallpaper paste. But oh man, it worked. It flowed like soup but was thick enough to fill you up. Army cooks adjusted the grain-to-water ratio, depending on how desperate the situation was. 1 part grain to 6 parts water was standard. But in rough times, you could see the bottom of your bowl and your soul. Sometimes if the army had herbs, salt, or even a little honey, they'd spice it. Just a touch of flavor could make the difference between morale and mutiny. In richer armies, barrels of honey were hauled around just to sweeten up the gruel. And in cold regions, grains were chosen by climate. Oats up north, rye in Central Europe, wheat in the Mediterranean, but usually only for the officers. Nutrition-wise, gruel had its perks. The long cooking time broke down the grain, making it easier for soldiers to digest and absorb nutrients. That meant more bang for your bite. Soldiers carried their own bowls and spoons, wooden usually, and lined up when meals were ready. And yes, there were rules about portioning. One surviving military manual from 1402 even says that officers should personally supervise the gruel line. So no one gets too greedy, because nothing ruins an army faster than gruel theft, apparently. Next up, let's sweeten things up, just a bit. Honey cakes. Yep, medieval soldiers had their version of protein bars, except these actually tasted good. Honey cakes were like battlefield power-ups, reserved for knights and elite fighters before crucial battles. These dense snacks packed serious punch. Made from a mixture of honey, ground nuts, and grains, they were formed into small, flat cakes, roughly the size of a hockey puck. Each one packed around 600 calories and delivered both fast and slow-burning energy. The sugar from the honey hit quickly, while the fats and carbs burned slow. It was a perfect pre-fight fuel-up. Some commanders even had the cakes blessed by priests before battle, believing they carried divine strength. If you were a knight biting into a honey cake just before battle, you probably felt like you were about to do something epic, even if your armor was caked in mud. Honey cakes weren't just food, they were morale. One English military record even mentions that commanders would promise cakes as a reward for the first soldier to breach a castle wall. Think of it as the Middle Ages version of, "Win this round, and I'll buy you lunch." But not every medieval meal was this sweet. Some were downright horrifying. And if you've made it this far, buckle up, because it's time for the blood porridge. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Hot grain porridge mixed with fresh animal blood. If that makes you gag, congratulations, you're officially a modern human. But to many medieval soldiers, this stuff was gold. It showed up especially in Northern Europe during cold campaigns, or when soldiers needed a brutal boost of energy. Why blood? For starters, it's full of iron and protein. And in medieval medical logic, it was believed to carry something called living heat. The idea was that blood gave you the strength, courage, and vitality of the animal it came from. Bulls were especially popular. Bull's blood was seen as the premium upgrade. Preparation was intense. They'd cook the porridge, usually oats or rye, then stir in fresh blood while it was still steaming. Add a dash of cinnamon, ginger, or pepper to cut the metallic taste, and boom, you've got yourself a dish that's half breakfast, half battle ritual. Some military records even describe punishments for soldiers who refused to eat their blood porridge. You either fueled up or faced the consequences. And believe it or not, this tradition actually evolved into modern dishes like black pudding and blood sausage. The takeaway? If you thought soldiers were only brave on the battlefield, think again. Just eating required courage. Okay, so far we've covered grain mush, garlic paste breath bombs, meat on a spit, blood soup, and energy pucks disguised as honey cakes. But here's a truth most people forget when they glamorize the whole knight in shining armor thing. Most medieval soldiers didn't die from battle wounds. They died from disease. And what kept them alive? It wasn't swords. It was fermented vegetables. Yuck-pickled cabbage and salty turnips were the real unsung heroes of medieval warfare. Let's talk about sauerkraut, the OG survival food. By the 1200s, shredded cabbage packed into barrels with salt became a military staple across Europe. Why? Because once it fermented, it could last for months without rotting, even in freezing weather or on long campaigns. No refrigeration, no preservatives, just salt, thyme, and funky bacteria doing their thing. Sounds gross? Maybe. But this tangy, crunchy stuff saved lives. You see, scurvy was the silent killer, caused by vitamin C deficiency. It made your gums bleed, your teeth fall out, and eventually shut down your body. Armies marching for months with no fresh fruit or veggies were basically slow max health disasters waiting to happen. But a handful of sauerkraut a day, that was the difference between standing tall or being buried in a shallow grave outside the camp. In areas where cabbage was harder to grow, soldiers relied on pickled turnips, sliced up, tossed in salt brine, and packed into barrels. They had the same vitamin-saving power. Military records from 1410 actually mention whole wagons filled with barrels of pickled vegetables following troops into winter battles. Imagine the smell. But seriously, the fermentation process boosted the nutrition. Properly pickled cabbage had 4 times the vitamin C of raw cabbage. That's a huge deal when your teeth are literally trying to escape your mouth. Did soldiers love the taste? Not really. But they learned fast. Eat your stinky veggies, or rot from the inside out. And yes, that phrase should absolutely be on a t-shirt. Fermented vegetables weren't just soldier food. They became long-term military strategy. By the 1700s, British Navy ships carried sauerkraut on every voyage. That's how important this weird little food hack became. It followed. Now, before we wrap this up, let's zoom out for a second. When we look at modern military rations, we think of MREs, meals ready to eat, vacuum-sealed pouches of shelf-stable food with printed calorie counts, and tiny hot sauce bottles. But back then, a medieval MRE was a sack of barley, a wedge of dried cheese, and maybe a jar of garlic paste if you were lucky. The medieval military diet wasn't about pleasure, it was about pure survival. Each food had a purpose: barley and fat, fast fuel to keep your legs moving; garlic and onions, immunity and a psychological edge; hard bread and cheese, portable calories and dental endurance tests; ale, hydration without disease; legumes, meat's cheaper cousin with staying power; gruel, bulk filler for hungry bellies; honey cakes, reward and morale booster before the carnage; blood porridge, nutrient bomb for the fearless; pickled vegetables, life insurance in food form. These weren't just random snacks. They were tactical resources. And honestly, it makes you respect those old warriors more. Because it wasn't just the weapons they carried. It was the fuel in their stomachs, the stink in their breath, the discipline to eat what kept them alive even when it tasted like sadness and regret. So, next time you're bored with your granola bar or annoyed that your protein shake didn't taste like a milkshake, just remember, some guy in 1387 scarfed down hot blood oatmeal with a garlic chaser before marching 20 miles in steel armor. You'll be fine. And hey, if you've made it this far, you're officially more informed about medieval combat nutrition than 99% of people out there. That's something. Maybe not something you can put on a resume, but still, respect. Before you go, let me ask you this. Which of these battlefield foods would you actually try? Barley mush, ale porridge, garlic paste power-up, or are you brave enough to taste the blood porridge? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. And if you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I've got plenty more wild history coming your way. Until next time, stay curious, stay strong, and maybe keep some pickled cabbage in your pantry. You never know.